This is the regular meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee. We have a quorum, Mr. Smith, Mr. Koretz, myself, Bernard Parks as chair. We have four closed session items. Colleagues, if we can move number 6 and number 7 as consent. Six has already been heard by the Jobs Committee, and basically we're approving one item today, and the other items are going to the BTAC.
7, yeah.
And then 7 is just
Yep, I'm good.
a refund. Okay. We could move those two items on consent. We're going to deal with items 1, 2, 3, and 4 in closed session, and then come back for the regular agenda. Thank you. Oh, look, before that, let me see. Mark, you want to just make public comment, or did you go? Okay, we'll deal with that when he comes back.
require.
We'll move item 3 on item 4. We'll move that one, but we'll ask the city attorney to assist the city clerk in giving them information regarding the comparative analysis between 8 and 09 and 9 and 10, first 6 months to expenditures, and also we'd ask the city attorney to provide the clerk information as to what and how they're going to reduce these costs in 10-11 budget year.
Right. Item number 5 on the agenda is the City Controller's Reserve Fund Statement of Condition Report and Status of all Reserve Fund loans as of December 31st, 2009.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Lamb from the Controller. At December 31st, we had 60...
Just hold on one second. I forgot to do something. Mr. Allen, you had a public comment card. Why don't you just stay there? Why don't you come up? You don't want? Okay, fine. Thank you.
At December 31st, we had $60 million outstanding in reserve fund loans. 2 different categories. Council-approved loans were $44 million, $15 million of which is expected to be repaid by June 30th. That included $14.9 million in advances that are to be repaid by judgment obligation bonds. $8.2 million was for long-term loans, including Aging, Potrero Canyon, and Runyon Canyon. 19.6 department is recommending for write-off. That was primarily Department of Transportation and funding from the Special Parking Revenue Fund. That did not happen. And there was also a $1.1 million advance to the Children's Museum, which is uncertain at this point given the bankruptcy issue. For the Charter Section 261I loans, which are for tardy receipt of revenue at year-end, $15.9 million was outstanding. $3.5 million are to be repaid by June 30th. $13.3 million is to be repaid by other city agencies to the department that is performing the work, and about $1 million departments will be recommending for write-off.
Okay. Let me just ask, in one of the notes in your report, you comment that there's a $833,000 amount that's approved but not transferred. What does that entail?
That's generally loans that have been approved or advances that have been approved that have not been processed by our fund and appropriation.
Not one outlay, it's multiple loans?
It could be multiple loans, yeah.
Okay, and then the other issue, when we dealt with the last controller's report, we asked the city CAO to somewhat be the enforcer in getting some of these loans in play or responded to. Are we having any success in that mediation process?
Yes, I can give you a quick update on a few of those items from that last report, but we have an exercise that's due tomorrow that our office has been coordinating on following up on some of the reserve fund loans, and we'll include the results of that exercise in our year-end fiscal report. So there has been some follow-up, and like I said, we'll report on that later. We did check with the mayor's office. One of the instructions was that the mayor be requested to issue an instruction to departments regarding the reserve fund loans, and I checked with the mayor's office this morning. They have drafted a memo. I've seen it. It will shortly go out to all departments, emphasizing the importance and the great need for departments to expedite any repayments to the reserve fund loan.
So that
I'm sorry, to the reserve fund.
Yet. So that their letter hasn't gone out because it was like 7 months ago we made that request.
It's imminent.
Okay, and then let me ask Mr. Controller, on one of your comments you show about $100 million temporary loan to the general fund. What does that entail?
That was for cash flow borrowing. There was one point earlier in the year before we had authority for interfund borrowing that we borrowed $100 million from the reserve fund, and then we repaid that as receipts came in.
Okay. And then the primary loan that's being asked to be written off is the SPRF. Now, I thought we, subsequent to our initial report, that we actually made that transfer.
It came into the reserve fund as a transfer, but not as a loan write-off.
Is that just
So-
some paperwork then?
Yes, sir. Either way, the money is in the reserve fund. We just still have the loan outstanding. So now it's recommended for write-off, but it would not change the reserve fund balance either
I
way.
think we need to make some form of a note to clarify that.
Okay.
Because I think in reading this, it appears that there's $19 million that we're writing off, when in effect, it went into the reserve fund directly, and although it's a paper situation, we need to clarify that with a footnote or something, so so people know it's not real money.
Yes, sir.
It's a mechanical paper issue, what pile we put the money in.
Right.
Well, Mr. Parks, from our office's perspective, we are going to issue a report by the end of this fiscal year that addresses the declaration of the surplus for the SPRF for this fiscal year, but we can certainly put in a formal, if it hasn't been done before, we can put a formal recommendation to write off that amount.
Okay. But I think it just needs to be explained, so that it's not any impression that $19 million is owed, and we're just saying we're not going to go after it.
Okay.
Okay. And then, again, for these items, we just need to continue to push on getting these loans paid before June 30th, and we need to continue the push on grants and special funds, that those funds and receipts are coming in before June 30th, and so that we can ensure that the maximum amount is within the reserve fund. Let me ask the controller, I have a letter April the 5th sent to your boss regarding the $73 million transfer of water and power. What is that impact? I think you're responding to it, but if you can give us some idea what that impact will cause on this report.
We have been, today, the reserve fund is $191 million. Without the $73 million from water and power, we will not be able to borrow. So we have also released a letter indicating that for May, we need to borrow, or we need a transfer of $90 million from the reserve fund to the general fund.
And that's to pay our ongoing bills.
Yes, sir. At May 5th, we will be short $10 million.
Even with that $90 million?
Without the $90 million.
Without the-
With the $90 million, we will be okay through June, or through May. As we get into June, we'll need more.
That would bring the reserve fund down to what, if that
The 90 would bring the reserve fund down to about $100 million.
100 million?
So it would go into, it would eat up the contingency reserve and go into the emergency reserve.
And Mr. Parks, I would add on that, our intention is to release the fourth FSR approximately Wednesday of this week for discussion at committee on the following Monday. And in our FSR, we'll actually detail that out, the impacts of if or if not we get that money on the reserve fund.
Okay. And I would assume that when the budget comes out April 22nd, I would guess that money's already been placed in the budget and probably allocated.
It'd be, yeah, April 20th, and you're talking about the 73 million?
Yes.
As far as of today, there's still, the budget has not been finalized. So they're still considering that issue.
Okay. And let me ask, Sharon, could you come up for a minute? One of the things that tomorrow we have a motion on the council calendar that deals with the transfer. And one of the things that we wanted to do is to put a substitute motion in for that, but we wanted a little more of the historical background, because if I understand it correctly, the charter requires them to declare the surplus at the close of the fiscal year.
That's correct.
Okay, and that surplus is roughly 8% of what they consider their profit.
80% of what?
8% when the surplus is supposedly 8% of what they
Right, the transfer is based on 8% by board policy. It's based on 8% of operating revenues.
Operating revenue.
And that 8% translated to the $220 million. Originally, it was estimated at 230 at the beginning of the year because it was estimated that operating revenues would be higher. At the close of the year, it turned out operating revenues were actually lower than anticipated, which resulted in an estimated DWP transfer of $220 million for the current year.
But they make that judgment. It wasn't
Right.
something imposed on them by the controller or the council.
Well, it's by board policy. By board policy, they established the percentage. Years ago, it was 5%. It was subsequently increased over the years to the current number of 8% of gross operating revenues. However, the single caveat, an additional caveat to that is that the percentage can never exceed net income. Their net income for June 30th of 2009 was in the $300 million range. However, as we've been talking about the energy cost adjustment factor over the course of the last few weeks, DWP is indicating that because of their cash flow situation and their need to go out to the bond market, that they have insufficient cash flow to meet all of their requirements. And that's, of course, the subject of debate right now. That is an additional factor that they have built into their transfer, and the from what I understand in their most recent correspondence to Controller Gruhl is that they indicate that they have technically no surplus. And so based on the no surplus scenario, they are indicating that they cannot make that additional $73 million transfer.
I think what we need your help on as the motion substitute tomorrow is that from whenever they made that judgment of 220, it was somewhere in 2009, they never commented that it was tied to ECAF or any other issues. And in fact, when we had the discussion of the 147 transfer in this committee, we specifically asked the official from the DWP when would the other half be forthcoming, and he specifically said in 2 months, with no real caveat about tied to any other financial maneuvering or anything else. We need to lay that out, and with your help on that motion, so that as we request that, it's really clear as to either they misled us or something dramatically changed in the last several weeks.
And I believe we've transmitted that motion at your request already.
Okay, very good.
Ms. So you'd proposed or mentioned once the idea of going to a monthly payroll rather than biweekly, and an opportunity then to push a large portion of that amount into the next year's budget.
Yeah, actually, our office and the mayor's office and the controller's office met, it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago, at council and mayor direction to look at potential options with regard to dealing with our cash flow situation. One of the items that was discussed was the possibility of moving to a monthly payroll. By moving to a monthly payroll, but that captures is a one or a biweekly gain in the current year. So the last payment of the year would actually be shifted into the following year. So that could improve your cash flow situation. We did have a brief discussion a few weeks ago, which is a possibility. There was some concern relative to actually changing the payroll system to a monthly basis. There could be some ways around that if it's done on a temporary basis. What I mean by that, it's almost equivalent to writing a check but not putting it in the mail. So you could capture that 2-week gain by leaving the payroll system as a biweekly but just not depositing the checks. So that would be one way in terms of a cash flow situation to at least on a very temporary basis, address our cash flow for the current year if necessary.
We could use that to address the cash flow, but we can't use it to balance the budget. We can't take it over from the current
Now,
fiscal year.
keeps you solvent for the 1 year of the, how much was the dollar amount?
Well,
It's in the $90 million range.
about $100 million
So
right now.
it's more than the one-time loss of the DWP money.
Right, but we would,
Accounting point of view, you get that value for a short term only.
well, except it becomes a liability of the current year. So,
Point is, it gets us through this year.
no, it gets us into a situation where we still need the cash to encumber that at year end. We can't push that into the next fiscal year without severe consequences to our financial statement and probably a qualified opinion.
Yeah, you've seen this letter, right?
Yes, sir.
We got it as we walked into the committee meeting today. What's your interpretation of this? We were under the impression in budget, frankly, that one wasn't tied to the other, and no matter how much I asked that question when we were going through this most recent process over ECAP, never did they say yes, it was a direct tie-in. How do you view this?
I think they're saying now that it's a direct tie-in, and there's one line in there that says we're not going to make the transfer.
Yeah, I see that one line in here. Yeah, there's no surplus money to transfer at this time.
And that puts us in a situation that we can borrow from the reserve fund for tardy receipt of revenue, but at this point, we're not going to receive the revenue, so we can't borrow. So that's why we will need the transfer from the reserve fund by action of the council and mayor. And without that, we'll be about $10 million in the hole on May 5th.
I see they use a bit of history here, that this year and that year. Were you around when they did that? And do you have any sense of what they're saying in this?
Basically, what they're saying is that it's at the time, it was 5% of gross not to exceed net income. And they were saying that there were years that they either didn't have the net income or didn't have the gross income. The situation this year is they have the gross income for the 220, they have the net income for the 220, but what they're saying is that because they have increased their cash reserves from 150 to 300, plus they've got $5.3 billion worth of debt, plus they're issuing more, that they don't believe that they have the resources to do the transfer without a rate increase. So I think you're right. They're explicitly tying it to a rate increase.
Yeah, and especially when we asked the question a million times, they were evasive at best. And when we went through this historically, it was never tied together one with the other.
Let me just have a couple of cleanup questions on the controller's report. I was just wondering, on some of these smaller write-offs, why wouldn't we collectively put them in a category of long-term as opposed to just writing them off? Because over time, they just cumulatively add up to real money. But the write-offs gives an impression it's over and done with. But yet from looking at your report, we've had some long-term loans that go on for decades.
Well, some of them, the aging is based upon if the aging program shuts down, then that gets repaid. The Potrero Canyon, the Runyon Canyon, those are long-term in nature. At one point, there was thought about writing them off, but I think Rec and Parks had some concerns about that, so they were reinstated.
Because we had that one that was in West LA that they were going to write off maybe last year, and we said, why don't you just make it a long-term until they finalize that project?
Right.
Yeah. But again, on the smaller ones, we've never considered that over time, just cumulatively putting them in ongoing, long-term, till eventually get our hands on the money as opposed to just writing them off?
Basically, what the departments are saying is there's no source of funding to pay those, or they were incorrect, and those were from a different source of funding that is not available. And in some cases, ones that we research, they're saying that they actually made a payment, but the payment went to the general fund as opposed to the reserve fund.
Because I can understand them not being eligible, And I can understand in instances where they overestimated and they're coming back. But if they just overspend, it just doesn't appear that just saying writing it off gives them any incentive to stay within their budget.
I think over the years, the departments have gotten better at this. What concerns me, frankly, at the year end this year is with the ERIP furloughs and layoffs, I am concerned that the amount of loans outstanding at June 30th are going to go up.
Well, I agree. They've gone up from last year to this year, and they'll keep going up, particularly if we can't get more mediation from our intervention from the CAO to get those paid, and if they continue to be lax on getting their reimbursement on grants and special funds, it will continue to rise.
And part of my concern is whether or not they have the accounting staff to do the work that needs to get done.
Okay, let me ask one other thing for the controller and the CAO. When do we expect the revenue report to come out for the third quarter? The projection for
Our March 1 report is the one that we do, and then we will work with the CAO, and I think the CAO's next report is tied to the budget on April 20th.
Yes, that's correct.
I mean, so we won't know our third quarter revenue figures until mid-April, or?
Yes, that's correct.
We're still closing the books for March at this point.
Okay. There's no way to get that earlier, because if we wait until the budget on the 20th, there's no ability to turn anything around. And
I actually discussed that with Ray Serrana this morning, but they still, at this point, have not locked down the budget for a few reasons, but they're still working on the revenue estimates for the proposed budget, which would include a projection for the revenues this fiscal year as well as next fiscal year.
Okay, and then the FSR is coming out when?
We would hope sometime this week, about the middle of the week, for discussion next Monday at Budget and Finance Committee.
Very good. Any other questions? Okay, we'll move item number 5 with those verbal directions.
Items 6 and 7 were approved on consent. So the next item is item 8.
You want my vote on 6?
Item 8 is the CAO
For the
report.
record, Mr. Rosenthal is here on, and will also concur on the consent
6 and
item
7.
6 and 7.
Okay. Consent items 6 and 7.
He will concur. He wasn't here when we dealt with consent. So Mr. Rosenthal will be added to the yes vote.
On items 6 and 7.
Yeah, okay, you want to discuss those?
No.
No, just consider me a vote.
I understand. Thank you. Item 8 on the agenda is a CAO report relative to the results of a survey to identify employees on loan from one city department to another city department.
Good afternoon. Carolyn Cooper, representing the Office of the City Administrative Officer. This was a report back request from Councilmember Cardenas with respect to surveying to find out how many employees were loaned from one department to another city department. And so the report before you contains that information. And I will answer any questions you have, but basically in summary, there was a total of 26 employees that have been loaned from one department to another.
You know, if I understood his motion, some of the things I think he was trying to get at is there some authority in the city that grants the permission to loan, and is there a timeline? Is there a review process? Those types of things, or is it just a phone call between two people that send somebody for 6 months to a year or longer to another assignment?
It's sort of a hybrid of what you just described. Basically, the city charter under section 233 gives the mayor the authority to have employees loaned out to another city department, but that does not include the proprietaries. And that provision speaks to 120 days in a calendar year. And there are also sections of the administrative code, section 3.6 and 4.340, 4.341, 4.342 and 4.343 all address the temporary transfer of employees. Los Angeles Administrative Code Section 4.34, I'm sorry, Section 3.6 basically restates Charter Section 233. But the statutes are silent on whether two general managers can strike up an agreement to loan somebody to another department. It's not really addressed. It only addresses the authority the mayor has.
Yeah, the charter only, in the administrative code, gives the mayor the authority. And is that directed to an individual to be loaned, or is that where you're allowed to have a perpetual body that just keeps flowing in that loan position?
It doesn't address it specifically, but it indicates that the mayor may make temporary transfers of employees not to exceed 120 days in any calendar year from one appointed office or department to another,
Okay, so
except the proprietary.
Employees. So you can move an employee, but does it limit at all that that employee can go one place for 120 days, go back, and then go to another place for 120? Does that?
It's not restricted, and nor is it addressed. And I should point out that some of these loans, these exchanges, are within the Department of Public Works, which, even though they're different bureaus, it's considered one department.
Oh, yeah.
So they basically, and that's included in the chart. So part of a portion of those 26 positions are basically Public Works loaning employees to itself.
I think there's less concern about people loaning within their own organization. It's those that are taken out of that organization when you believe the budget is giving them so many authorities, yet they're working totally in a different environment on a semi-permanent loan. I think that's what the concern was.
Right, and if you notice on the summary chart that I have on the first page of the CAO's report, several of those positions were loaned to LACERS, to the city's retirement system, to assist with ERIP.
Yes.
So that was a significant portion of them.
Now, what about the workers' comp? Is that something unique?
That I can't speak to exactly, but where the airport loaned the workers' comp positions to personnel department to assist.
Yeah. I mean, would that be identified as workers' comp that addressed airport issues totally, or is that just help personnel department to get over it?
I don't know the answer to that exactly. I assumed it was to assist with the airport workers' comp issues.
Yeah, I have just one question dealing with special funded positions. I see some of these are BOS funded. If you have a person that's being special funded out of a fund that, like BOS, where they collect money from wastewater
Correct.
for a specific job, and we cannot take that person and give them another job because we go to the taxpayers and bill them basically for that job. And if they're not doing that job, then how can we legally go back to the taxpayers and have them pay the fee, whether it's a wastewater fund, whether it's street maintenance, whatever it may be? They're supposed to be doing that work and that work only.
Understood. And most of these, from what I can tell from the survey that we've did, that these positions that are loaned out, there is a nexus. They're doing similar work. So, for example, the Bureau of Contract Administration loaned a construction inspector to building and safety with this particular expertise in dealing with getting state certification for analyzing, I don't have the exact words, but something with, let me see, I do have it written down, that the construction inspector was loaned to the Building and Safety Test Lab to assist in obtaining a state certification for ultrasonic testing of welds. So it's not that people are still, when they're loaned out, they're still in their same classification, so they're still going to be confined to do the job duties that are appropriate for that classification, and it appears that they are working in the same.
But those would be a very temporary loan then.
Correct.
I'm looking at more permanent loans, and I know some of these in the mayor's office go back a decade or more.
Yeah, I don't have that information, but I'm not aware of that. I don't know.
Well, I know there's some positions that have been from building and safety loaned to the mayor's office that continued all the way back into the Reardon administration.
Yeah, currently they have one position, they reported they had one position loaned to the mayor's office, and I don't know the nature of that one, other than it's a senior building mechanical inspector. So that one I don't have additional information on, but currently there's just one position.
Maybe we should have maybe look at a policy that states that these loans have to be certified, that they're doing a specific job that relates specifically to that classification and the time frame from which they are needed. There were some people that were loaned for building and safety to work on the Staples project many years ago when Dick Reardon was mayor. They reverted back, some of them. So that was understandable. Some of these positions, I think, have been there a long, long time, and I'm not so sure they relate to the position, the work they're even doing anymore sometimes. So just a thought process for CAO, maybe we need to have a little stronger control of that, saying before you make that loan, you tell us what they're going to be doing and how it benefits the office, whoever's borrowing them for that purpose, and then when they're going to go back.
Let me just add, and I think following along with what Mr. Smith said, if we can, this is a note and file and move it to council, but I'd like to give direction to the CAO to work with developing, with personnel to develop a policy as to what the authority for loans are within the general managers or the mayor, and so that it's clear as to who has authority to make those loans, and also that there be some connection that where they're loaned, that they're doing the task in which they were hired in their home department, so that they're not just being taken out of their assignment and doing something totally foreign than what their task, particularly as Mr. Smith commented on, if they're special funds, they would have to have some connection in their loaned assignment for what the special funds were doing. And if we can clarify on that Department of Airport, those 6 positions, were they specifically working on LAWA-type activities in their assignment or their loan to personnel? But we do need to have some more clear policy on loans, the length of time, who has the authority, and this is probably for lack of a better term, it would appear if they get to be in a long-term situation that we have to have a process much like managed hiring, that they got to come through for a renewal or something, and that may not be the right process, but something similar to managed hiring, that after 120 days, that if you're going to renew that same loan by another body, that you can't, sidestep the system without some other review.
Mr. Parks, if I may suggest, we can probably have the answer on the airport employees question by the time the report gets
Get that to the clerk
to
for
the council.
report, but I think the asking for that other process of a policy is something I think we need to have in play, because I think this initially, it was Cardenas's motion, but I think it was also discussed to some degree out of the budget process also, and there was discussion about loans and who's responsible and where are they and who tracks them and things of that nature.
My only suggestion is that you probably add the city attorney to that group as well, because there's existing provisions that deal with, as Carolyn said, with parts of this, so it might have to be looked in the greater context of what's actually on the books as well.
Yeah, so we'll ask the CAO, the city attorney, and personnel department to come back, and what would you think on time? I know the budget's getting ready to get started.
I'll defer to Carolyn for a response on that.
And don't use the word summer at all.
Don't use it. Is this before or after I ERIP now? We can try to get it as soon as possible. I don't know about the collaborative effort, how soon we can get all the entities together, because obviously this is codified in the city charter, so we're somewhat limited there
Yeah,
without going
but
back to the voters.
If I understand it, you're saying the city charter affects the mayor, who has some very clear guidelines, but then folks below the mayor, do they have any guidelines?
So your concern, just to narrow it down a little bit, your concern is primarily with departments making arrangements with other departments, not necessarily involving the mayor's office, when the mayor's office is not involved.
But I think the mayor's office, I think there is a concern if you have 10-year loans with no review, because the charter says 120 days, if you have a perpetual 120 days, you seem to be somewhat outside of the charter.
And even if there's a charter requirement, that doesn't mean we can't put in the ad code further definitions. Charter may just say 120 days, but we can say if it meets the following criteria.
Right, right. And I should point out that there is some reporting guidelines that are articulated in Charter Section 233 involving the city clerk's office, and
So they're reporting to another entity that these loans are forthcoming?
the onus is on the mayor's office to do the reporting, but it's spelled out in the charter.
To whom?
It says the mayor shall notify the city clerk at the time the transfer of employees is made, and the city clerk shall notify the president of the council, the director of, it refers to CAO, it says ORS, but I mean CAO, and the Board of Civil Service Commissioners of the transfer.
I've never seen one.
So if we have that as a process and come back with some clarity and where we might tighten up, that would be appreciated.
Okay.
All right?
Okay, thank you.
So we'll move item 8 with those verbal directions.
All right. The last item on the agenda is item number 9, a motion Koretz Zain Han relative to the transfer of funds and staffing needs to support the continued enforcement efforts of the city attorney's office in regard to illegal supergraphic signs and related actions.
Is there someone else reporting on this, or?
Mr. Parks, I think, has some information on number 9. Did you want to continue number 9?
I think we want to discuss it and see if we
Yeah.
can formulate something.
No, I asked if there was someone else reporting on this.
We have the city attorney here.
Yeah,
Part of-
that's,
And they also should have some information of whether Plum still intends to
Right.
hear this.
Good afternoon.
this must be really important, they send you guys over.
We're the only ones here today. That's it. Good afternoon, council members. Bill Carter and David Michelson with the City Attorney's Office. We are prepared to discuss the motion from Councilman Koretz. We understand that this was jointly assigned to the Plum and this committee. I have not had an opportunity to discuss this with Councilman Reyes. Perhaps my colleague, Mr. Michelson, has.
We're in communications with Councilmember Reyes' office. We're going to have further discussions with them to see if they have any specific questions that can be answered, to see if the council member would be willing to waive it out of committee. I do not know whether he will be willing to do so until we have further discussions with him and with his staff. But we will continue to reach out to him and talk with him.
Yeah, and the reason he would get it is because some of it deals with building and safety.
Well, I guess when the motion was introduced to council, it was double assigned to both Plum and to Budget and Finance. We didn't realize it actually was assigned to Plum until late Friday. Plum being the policy committee to some extent, there may be some policy implications that Councilmember Reyes wants to address in Plum. Ideally, we can address those offline for him, but we're definitely going to have that dialogue with him quickly.
Okay. We are prepared to discuss the substance of the motion. We do have some numbers that might be of use to the committee. We obviously are fully engaged in the aggressive enforcement of the billboard and supergraphic laws in the city. We are definitely in need of investigators We've had conversations both with Councilmember Park and also Councilmember Koretz's office. Our position is, however the council sees fit and the committee sees fit to get us investigators, we're open to any and all suggestions, whether they be city employees or staff that have the requisite experience and knowledge. We're open to looking at those people that we can help save their positions or fund their positions. We have identified at least one person in personnel that might have the requisite experience that we could use and fund that person's position. We had heard at one point that there may be some individuals in the Department of Building and Safety. Certainly we would love to have people like that working with us. But I'm not sure if there are any people in that category whose positions are in jeopardy. I don't know that. If we do not have a pool of city employees that would be within the group of folks with the requisite experience, then the only other option would have to be looking at, to carry us over for a short period of time, to use private investigators, which on occasion we do have to use. We do have a handout if council members, committee members would want to look at that. We've done some rough calculations and the support for that. But at this point, we are just asking to be able to use those money in any way you see fit in order to get investigators for us.
All right, there's an overarching sort of desire and sense of urgency from the city attorney's office to get this litigation support for the ongoing and, in essence, stepped up aggressive enforcement efforts taking place in the city attorney's office. You've seen about it, you've heard about it on TV and seen it in the newspapers. We're meeting with success. We've got a fair amount of litigation, both criminal cases filed, 17-200, Business and Professions Code, what we call unfair competition cases filed. We need adequate litigation support to maintain that effort and to give us the best chance to be successful as possible. So the overarching concern is getting that help and getting it now, because the need is indeed now, and probably sustained for approximately 12 months. This particular source of funding comes from a 2003 settlement agreement involving a super graphic sign, actually, in Westwood, on the Westwood Medical Building. And this is a very unusual sort of one-off type of settlement agreement that over the years has provided roughly now about $600,000 to the city. And it seems to us, and I think Councilmember Koretz and Councilmember Zine, and we're very thankful for them bringing this motion in, also agreed that this is a very appropriate use of this kind of money that we've received from a company involved in putting up super graphic signs around the city, turning around and using it for appropriate enforcement efforts with respect to illegal signs. So it seemed to be an excellent source of funding to help meet this important need that we have now.
Yeah, here's the problem, and I asked the CAO to come up if they would. While I don't argue the point one bit that you've been very successful, we need to do this work, it does violate a policy that we have as far as one-time monies goes. And so my concern is that you're keeping people on the payroll or putting people on the payroll to become a one-time funded function that we now have to deal with them in another year's budget, which goes against the city's budget policies. So the question is how we would get around that. How do you see that? Does the CLA have any recommendations? CAO?
Yes, I mean,
I think our concern would be with regard to continuing costs. I understand Mr. Carter's mention of using it for layoff displacement, but that would be layoff displacement only for the next 3 months. We're getting ready to embark upon the 2010-11 budget, which we all know is well in the $400 million range, and it is very likely that there are going to be additional cutbacks and layoffs as part of the proposed budget for next year. So to the extent we can maybe do layoff avoidance for a few positions at this time, I don't know whether that's going to be a long-term solution.
Well, it's obviously not a long-term solution, but there may be some. Go ahead.
our concern, of course, we haven't seen the plan until in just a few minutes ago, so we weren't quite necessarily apprised of the scope of what they were proposing until just now. But our concern really is just immediately for this fiscal year. The city attorney, their office has done I'd say an admirable job at trying to close their budget gap this year. They've had severe challenges. They've made great progress, but they still, in our FSR, when we release this week, will still have a deficit of several $1 million just to close their own budget. And I think the question that our office would raise is, given that, and they would probably have to seek an additional appropriation at some point this year, if these funds can be used to offset their own budget deficit this year, that might be something that the council should consider.
And what about the ability to hire back on contract rather than avoiding layoff?
If I can
Bring
add-
people in.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
To answer that point, we are not asking for this money to balance our budget. We've never asked for that. We're not asking for that.
Understood.
We think this money should be used as a nexus to billboard enforcement. And we'll balance our budget without this money. And we can do that a number of ways, and we're heading towards that. In fact, we hope to have a surplus by the end of this fiscal year. I can't promise that, but that's what we're working for. And in terms of, we see this money as seed money, holding us over, whether we can prevent someone from being laid off or using this money in some way as displacement. We hope it would be a great way to use this money as a nexus to billboard enforcement and to find people within the city family that have this skill set. Because just as we do in environmental and consumer enforcement, we bring in about $2 million a year on environmental and consumer enforcement. We've done that consistently. I think with respect to billboard enforcement, we can do the same thing. Looking in the future, I can see that. And in terms of balancing our budget, we have a major environmental settlement that we will have, which will also fund our office. So with respect to the layoff issue, we're open to whatever we can do to prevent layoffs. And we've heard the mayor, we've heard the council, we've heard others say, find ways to prevent those layoffs, and we're open to that. But we're not asking for this money to balance our budget.
Yeah, and Bill, I think you had me all the way up until the point where you said you saw this as an ongoing possibility. I think environmental laws, people will continue to violate the environmental laws. There will be a lot of opportunities for you to recuperate things on an ongoing basis. Because there's only a few handful of billboard companies, I don't see this as a sustained violation. I think we've slammed them pretty hard. And once you start to get compliance, I think it dies out. That's my concern. I don't think it's an ongoing revenue
There's
stream.
two pieces to this. We have, as you see in our handout, the civil lawsuits. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry. We're going to be fighting these people for a long time. On the defense side, that's Roman numeral 1. We'll be fighting them for a long time. And so our investigators will help us on the defense side. And if we lose any of these civil suits that have been filed against the city, we could be hit for tens of millions of dollars because of damages. So, I mean, these investigators are for defensive purposes, as well as we have just started the offensive period here. So we have now turned and are pushing back on these folks. Now, these billboard investigators could also dovetail into other code enforcement, and that code enforcement dovetails into what Councilman Koretz has done with the ACE program. We have the administrative code enforcement motion and ordinance that is pending, and we think that we are going to have an ability to use these on both sides.
And we have this significant push going on, starting probably a month or two ago, that will probably be sustained for, I would assume, at least the next 12 months. And getting folks working now, investigators who are experienced, trained, and competent, who can hit the ground running, is a critical need. And maybe it's a combination of, if there's an employee, for instance, in the personnel department who might be sort of detailed over to the city attorney's office and maybe potentially save a position over there, but the balance of it potentially being contracted out. We've got, for instance, a healthy panel and good panel of outside investigative firms already solicited and ready to go, so potentially sort of a combination of the two efforts to be able to get people working quickly, trained, competent folks working quickly on these cases might end up being the sort of the prudent route, both bringing folks over who are city employees now, who were willing to come over if their general manager might be open to that solution, and contracting out the balance of that possibly.
There's also the ability to disgorge illegal proceeds. And that's where you need financial analysts and others to say, if this billboard was up for so many years, generating so much profit, that's the city's. And we will take that.
Okay. The chairman's returns, I'll return the microphone back to him. I'm done with my questions for the moment.
Let me, one of the things, and I just want to make sure I understood, on dealing with next year's budget or this year's budget, and I heard you comment about the potential of a major settlement on a lawsuit, and I think it may be a misnomer to believe that settlements stay in the department. I think we have to think about those are general fund dollars that we may give some of it back to you, called personnel and salary, but I don't think the budget should be based on we're going to win this settlement, we're going to keep it.
Some are and some aren't.
Okay. But I think that's a serious, maybe a serious miscalculation, because it rarely do we fund things in that fashion. And so it's, if we deal with this also with the fire department, in the sense that they come up and say, we found this money, we say thank you, and we put it over the general fund. So I think we got to be clear about that.
I'm aware of that, and I've been very careful as to what I said and where the money is going.
If I could on that, because it goes to what I said earlier, and that I don't think it's sustainable. We do that with the building safety department, with the enterprise fund. But with that fund, when they don't have money in it, they don't get the stuff.
That's right.
So if you're willing to take that chance.
We are.
Right?
And then one of the things, and this is just a question to CAO, this money's been sitting there since 2003, and we probably have had 7 sweeps, and how did you miss it?
This money is not obviously on budget. As far as we can tell, we became aware of the issue late last week, but as far as we can tell, was never deposited as general fund receipts either. It shows up in the balance sheet as basically in a cash account. So I think the question you raise is...
The settlement set that up that way, as opposed to, when, is that, I mean, how did that happen?
I can speak to the issue when you're done, Mr. CEO.
I mean, with the city...
If you can provide further detail, go ahead, David.
The city clerk would set that?
The settlement agreement was intended to have the money come in annually. Most of it did not come in for quite a few years. They just weren't paying. So more recently, probably about a year ago, don't hold me to that, I have to go back and double check, but probably about a year ago, we started applying pressure to pay up, quite frankly. And so relatively recently, I think a fair amount of money came in the door, and that represents the bulk of the money. And the checks were placed over in the Treasury Department for the city in a miscellaneous account.
That's what I mean. That's what I think the issue of understanding how it came in is one thing, but how did the account get set up to where it's offline?
I don't think the account was set up to be offline. These are checks that come in from settlements of various lawsuits. They're placed, it's my understanding, in this miscellaneous account with the Treasury Department until they're allocated to go to the right location, the right account within the city that would be the ultimate
If
landing.
settlements come in, from what I understand, the only right account would be the general fund. I mean, we don't fund anything unless there's something that I'm not aware of.
Councilman, I can't speak to this particular settlement other than it happened before I got here. I can guarantee you there'll never be another settlement like this while I'm here.
And that's what we call this a one-off settlement. It's a very unusual settlement. But we'll answer specifically your question about what sort of the life history of this money has been in the account. We're happy to do
Let
that.
me just comment, and I follow along with Mr. Smith. I think the issue that I'm concerned about is that this is a 7-year account that basically, if you divide it, it's about $90,000 per year. And I don't know whether we expect that amount in future years. That's at most a body as far as salary and overhead. And I don't believe at this time of the budget year, I would be supportive of hiring more bodies or retaining bodies that we know is on the list that we're going to be cutting. And then the second thing is that until we get the mayor's budget, which we understand on somewhat that those numbers might be rising as far as layoffs, and to create a unit or an effort that's going to be short-lived and spend $500,000 or more, to me, that money should be dealing with something else. The one thing I would be sensitive to in looking at the chart is, without personnel things, but the investigators and the travel, which is a hundred and some odd thousand, if that's like a pilot or a 6-month program, I'd be more inclined to look at that as opposed to investing in overhead and people that we know we can't afford. And I think every time we place a person back in a situation, we're finding it in the proprietaries, eventually they're going to feel the bulge as they're being, I think, somewhat helpful in taking people online. They're going to eventually feel the bulge, and that will be a short-time position because they're going to start saying we can't afford those people or these positions. So I think we have to look at it in a larger sense of, can we afford to buy people, or if you already have a viable list of investigators that have the expertise you need and can do something very quickly, then it would seem to be a more reasonable investigation, particularly if we have an understanding of what we think the outcome is going to be. We're going to handle X number of cases, or the potential of recovering X number of dollars. Those are the things that would be viable and real, and if it's a short-term, 6 month or something, you can then assess it at the 5th month and say, you know, what did we accomplish? Did we spend a couple $100,000 or $150,000 and we got this return? Is it worth the continual process? But to put somebody on the payroll and say they may make it to June 30th, and then again the likelihood is they won't, and we spent a large amount of money, to me doesn't seem to be the proper investment.
Well, we're open to any and all suggestions. As Councilman Parks knows, and others, we've been talking to the mayor and other council members about incentivization. We are, as Councilman Smith said, if we're willing to run the risk, we are willing to run the risk. If you give us a number, we'll hit that number or try to hit that number, whether it be collections. We're asking for more responsibility with collections. We want all of workers' comp. We want to do workers' comp. We think we can save money. We have this ACE program that Councilman Koretz and others are pursuing. Will give us a number. We'll hit that number. If you want us to hit a number on billboards, consumer, environmental, we can do it. And I agree with Councilman Parks. I don't think we or anyone should rely on this particular settlement to generate so much money a year and that be the basis for funding or saving a body. But we see this money as a short-term attempt or a bridge, whether it's 6 months or a year, whether we fund or save some bodies from layoff or a combination of that with investigators. This is a bridge to get to the incentivization where we say we will hit these numbers and we think we can generate or save, whether it be defense case or prosecution case or disgorgement of illegal proceeds. We are open to all suggestions.
Let me ask you, on your page 3, are those numbers represent the 178 gets you to June 30th and the 795 gets you through next fiscal year?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by this. Obviously, I think our city attorney, in his most recent moment, has done an incredible job on putting the billboard companies at notice. And I think the super graphics is dramatic and very positively received by our community. Basically, what you're saying is, let us have this money. There's enough going on out there that we're going to focus on it, and that we will make the best use of this money in enforcing existing laws.
Yes, correct.
And we know, you know now, you've been here 6, 8, 9 months, that there's a heck of a lot of lawsuits out there with the billboard industry, correct?
Yes, we just, I hate to say one, but we did beat back 2 last week in federal court.
Right. And with that track record or that energy that I say, for me, it's just a matter of, can you continue this? And you say you can. You say there's enough on the plate for us to deal with right now that we can see various things out of it. So if we were to give you this money, that would be moving it in that direction.
Yes, they're a well-funded, entrenched adversary.
Yeah. Yeah, and one other thing that intrigued me, you mentioned something about a revenue stream that we might be able to get out of it. One of my big problems with these billboards, among the visual blight and the safety issues, is we get no revenue stream. All they get is in-place location, and that's it. And when they flip from a passive billboard to a digital, the 20 or so in my district, we saw no revenue stream whatsoever. And yet there's significant amount of revenue streams for them. How do you see yourself going in that direction of that?
We did submit, and David, you can respond to that. You want to respond to that, David?
Certainly. Thank you, Bill. Councilmember Rosendahl, last week we did submit to all the council members an attorney-client privileged communication, a report that goes into a fair degree of detail along those very lines about various options and the legal aspects of those options. We tried to put a lot of thought and consideration into that, and we'd be happy to come over and meet with you and talk about that. Absolutely.
Well, I know we're not buying a pig in a poke on this one. I know we're buying a very aggressive strategy from the city attorney's office, so I'm in support of us moving in that direction.
Well, I think I have just a few comments, no real questions. Number one, the idea that this should only be match the $90,000. I don't think this is viewed as an endowment where we have to take it year by year. I think it's viewed as more of an aggressive shot at this with a clear nexus to the billboard industry, which has been pretty much renegade, and some money that came from that fact and dealing with one of the super graphics. I think one of the things we have to look at is there's a lot of money to be pulled back in from this, and we're also, I know, looking at or have already increased fines and permit fees that we could, the disgorging idea. There's a lot of places where money could come from, and I think we could be talking about capturing millions of dollars a year in the next few years, and for a relatively modest amount of money, which for whatever reason it was lying around, we happen to have found it, and it's a perfect nexus. And I don't know that we have a policy reason to say, let's be sure and lay 4 people off now, don't you dare hire them and keep them on for another 4 years. I don't see what the pain is in doing that. It may well be that this program works so well that we want to continue funding those positions. It wouldn't surprise me. So I wouldn't necessarily assume the negative that we have to can them, in 6 months or a year. It could turn out that this is so successful we want to be sure and keep them on. In fact, one of the directions we've given is where employees are making money for the city, we try not to lay them off. So if it proves that these people wind up being a terrific investment, it's possible we might keep them on longer. But certainly getting the billboard industry under control and bringing in a lot of revenue at the same time and keeping a few people on staff instead of laying them off seems like an all-win situation to me.
Let me ask you, did we find out what Plum?
I hope to have more information on that later today, Council Member. We are in contact with Councilmember Reyes' staff and his office, and ideally he'd be comfortable maybe to waive it out of Plum. If not, we'd like to have it heard Plum at the first available opportunity.
We heard this morning that they were looking at 2 weeks.
That's what I heard as well. So there's a few of us in the office, including myself, that have reached out to the council member and his staff to see what we can do about that.
Do we have a meeting next week?
I believe we do. Yes.
Okay. Could you find out about that, and if we can ask the CAO and the CLA to put a report together on this motion so that we can reschedule it on for next Monday? The other thing I think we have to think about, again, for the larger budget, and I hope that the CLACO, in looking at it, is that just as we've seen over the last week or so, every group that shows up, our effort is to save them, and the larger budget is deteriorating. And just as we are hassling on the previous issue of $73 million that may not be forthcoming, we're in the process of saying every dollar might be put in to save a library hour or just keep us from these insolvency issues. So
I think that is the dilemma, Mr. Chair. We view these as general fund dollars, And, we're not speaking out against this proposal. We've only seen it here this time as well. But that really is a decision for the mayor and council to decide whether they want to use these general fund monies for this program or some other program. So it really is at your discretion, but your point is well taken that if it could be done with contractual resources so that maybe after a pilot period you don't have the continuing costs of someone on board and then needing to lay off if the program didn't work or if the revenues weren't generated, et cetera, et cetera. So there are several considerations.
Issues that in the past we've dealt with revenue positions that were in play creating revenue, then speculating on what revenue they might create. And I think that's a little twist of in our history. So if we can get that CAO report and reschedule this for Monday, and then hopefully you'll have some word from Plum, and I'll try to talk to Ed Reyes tomorrow myself.
Great,
But
thank you.
again, I think we have to keep it in a broader perspective. Okay. Before you guys leave, Mr. Dennis Hathaway, come on up on this mic here, and they'll listen in case you have a question that they can respond to. No, just don't pull your.
Good afternoon, committee members. My name is Dennis Hathaway. I'm president of the Coalition to Ban Billboard Blight. We're a organization representing individuals and community organizations throughout the city of Los Angeles. And I'm not qualified to speak to any of the issues that were discussed here about the budget and where this should fit. However, I can speak to one issue, and that is that people in this city consider these a terrible blight and a degradation of the quality of life in this city. And I know that's because I get telephone calls and emails every day from people who are upset about a building down their street or where they drive that has been covered with a huge sign. It's suddenly become an advertisement. Some of these communications I get have been from people inside these buildings who can't, suddenly looking out the windows like looking out at a dirty windshield. And they've heard about the fire department concerns about these, and they're very concerned about, am I safe in this building? Because it's got a big vinyl sign on it. So the city attorney is clearly, a new day has dawned in enforcement with the election of the new city attorney. And the money involved, just to give you an example, there were two signs on a building at Highland and Santa Monica Boulevard, and they were actually just taken down. And those signs were up there for 4 years. We have verified figures or verified information that these signs in a really high traffic area can get up to $100,000 a month. So you can do the math and see how much money is there. And if the city attorney's office can even get a portion of that, that would be a significant help to the city. But I think, just to close, really the important issue, though, is what these signs are doing to the city and how they're affecting people in the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Carter, by chance, is this proposal part of your 10-11 budget?
It is not. This is manna. I mean, this fell into our laps. We have other proposals for our budget: workers' comp, ACE, collections, subrogation. We've asked, give us a number, we'll hit the number, give us a percentage of that number. This is in addition. We every year there's a budget number for us for certain environmental and other consumer protection, and we'll hit that number every year. This will be in addition to that.
This check literally just came in within the last few weeks.
This was something that we just saw within the last month.
Right.
And I think I discussed it with you maybe a few weeks ago, Council.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll reschedule this on the next
Thank you, Councilman.
Monday and ask for the CAO seal.
Is there any additional information you need from our office? I will certainly provide it.
CAO will get with you as they prepare that report.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other items?
No, that concludes the agenda.
Cards, and so we're adjourned.